Welcome to the Quincy Institute's panel titled The Global South and the Gaza Assault. My name is Trita Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a transpartisan think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. Those are ideas that I think that right now is in dire need of American foreign policy. If we take a look at what is happening in Gaza right now, Israel's harsh and indiscriminate bombing following the attacks by Hamas on October the 7th has invoked a major and remarkably convergent response across the global South. States as diverse as South Africa, Chile, Mexico, and Indonesia have initiated or have forcefully participated in international legal action on Palestine, including a case at the International Court of Justice alleging genocide by Israel. Meanwhile, the United States continues to be by far the biggest backer of Israel's assault, including being the key supplier of weapon, its chief shield at the UN Security Council, and giving it diplomatic and political protection, with Biden continuing to resist putting any material pressure on Israel to change course. How do different countries across the global South view the war in Gaza? How has this increased the contradictions in the international system? And what is needed to rebuild confidence and trust between the global majority on the one hand and the United States on the other hand, given Washington's refusal to, on the one hand, stop this conflict while at the same time pressuring a lot of other countries in the global majority to support the United States in Ukraine? We have a fantastic panel that will address these and other questions today. We are delighted to have with us Filipe Nasser, Senior Advisor to Brazil's Foreign Minister, Professor Samar al-Bulushi of the University of California of Irvine, and of course, Sarang Shidore, the head of Quincy Institute's Global South program. For those of you who are joining via Zoom, as always, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. I will do my utmost to get to those questions throughout the conversation. If you're watching this on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, you can also put in your questions in the comment section, and we will try to get to those as well. So without any further ado, let me introduce our esteemed panelists. Filipe Nasser is a Brazilian career diplomat and current senior advisor to Brazil's Foreign Minister, Mauro Vieira. Mr. Nasser has had several postings, including in Brazil's embassy here in Washington, D.C., but also at the UN mission of Brazil in New York. He founded and served as the first editor-in-chief of UCA, the yearly journal of Brazil's diplomatic academy. Samar al-Bulushi is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and assistant professor of anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. She's a former contributing editor at Africa is a Country and has published in a variety of public outlets on topics ranging from the International Criminal Court to the militarization of American foreign policy in Africa. And last but not least, we have Sarang Shidore, who of course is the director of the Global South program here at the Quincy Institute, and also a senior non-resident fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks. He is also a member and an adjunct faculty at the George Washington University, where he teaches a class on the geopolitics of climate change. His areas of research and analysis are geopolitical risk, grand strategy, and climate security, with a special emphasis on the global South and Asia. So I'm going to turn to you first, Filipe. Luck so has it that on October 1st of last year, Brazil became the president of the Security Council. 7 days later, you had the Hamas attacks. 10 days after that, the invasion of Gaza by Israeli forces and the beginning of the bombardment. Brazil put forward a resolution at the time that was quite benign compared to later ones. It did not call explicitly for a ceasefire in terms of using that terminology, but rather the term that was adopted by the Biden administration, which was a humanitarian pause. Nevertheless, the Biden administration vetoed that resolution, the first out of 3 resolutions that Biden has vetoed since the beginning of this phase of the conflict. Walk us through what happened in that month, what the thinking was on the Brazilian side, and the reaction to this veto by the Biden administration and the reaction of other global South countries that supported Brazil in this. And it should be noted, the United States was the only negative vote in that against that resolution. All others either voted in favor of it, and one country abstained, and that was the United Kingdom. Filipe, tell us what happened. You are on mute.
That's becoming a habit. Greetings from the seat of the foreign ministry in Brasilia. Thank you, Trita. Let me also greet my fellow co-panelists, Professor al-Bulushi. Sarang, it's good to see you again. So Brazil was an elected member of the Security Council at that point in time. We were, of course, serving a two-year period in the council, the years 2022 and 2023. So by sheer alphabetical lottery, it fell upon us to chair the Security Council in the month of October 2023. And incidentally, if that's the right word, 1 week later, the crisis in Gaza struck. And the foreign minister at the time, the gentleman under whom I serve now, was touring Southeast Asia doing diplomatic work. So upon the orders by President Lula, he traveled all the way to New York to summon the first emergency sessions that we held under the council's auspices to address the situation in Gaza. Few days later, we concocted a draft resolution that, and I don't want to get this wrong. I'm gonna read it from the text. The draft resolution that we put together condemned the hideous terrorist attacks committed by Hamas. It demanded the release of all hostages. It condemned every form of terrorism and violent acts against civilians. And of course, it called upon the Israeli government to rescind the order of evacuation of civilians in the north portion of Gaza. And last but not least, proposed a humanitarian pause, which was in a way a concession to the more direct and blunt language of establishing a ceasefire. So the one thing that we must bear in mind when we think about the draft resolution put together by Brazil at the time, that this was not a Brazilian text per se. This was an effort to interpret and synthesize the sentiment of the 15 members of the Security Council. So very high stakes diplomacy was taking place at the time to make sure that the resolution mustered enough support to be adopted and help the situation on the ground. So these directives, the instructions contained in the draft resolution were very objective. They were not only sharing an idea of what the situation should be, it was trying to get the situation on the ground actually improved. So we put the resolution to vote with the expectation, because of course, high-level consultations, as I said before, were taking place at a very high level in the various capitals of the world. This was not only a job carried out but they did very competently by our mission to the UN in New York. This was also happening in various capitals in Europe and across the world to make sure we had enough support to adopt the resolution. And quite honestly, we were under the impression that the resolution would be approved. It came a little as a surprise that one of the permanent members of the Security Council did not cast a positive vote, actually cast a negative vote to the proposal that we had concocted as a collective effort, reflecting the sentiment of the Council at that opportunity. After the draft resolution was vetoed, we were still president of the Security Council, and we remained a non-permanent member of the Security Council all the way through December last year. And we put every effort together to help establish a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause, for that matters, help with the release of the hostages back to Israel and back to their original countries when that was the case. And we also put together a very sensitive diplomatic operation to release our own nationals that were both in Gaza and in Israel. 13 flights spearheaded or carried out by the Brazilian Air Force went first to Rome, then to the region to pick up around 1,500 Brazilians from Gaza and from Israel, and they were brought safely back home. And just a side note, with absolutely no charge for them. This was a humanitarian operation as far as we understood it. And those people are now, they're either Brazilians or they're Jewo-Brazilian, Israeli or Brazilian Palestinian nationals.
Very interesting. So the expectation was that the resolution would pass and that it would not get a negative vote. What was the reactions to the negative vote, both inside the Brazilian government and from other countries in the Council as well as in the Global South to this veto?
I guess the answer to your question, Trita, is that no matter what the sentiment in Brazil's government was, and of course we're very frustrated having made the concessions to make sure the draft resolution was as reflective of a collective sentiment as opposed to our own views. I think what we felt was this was a wasted opportunity to help the people on the ground, to stop the violence, to stop people from being needlessly killed on the ground.
Thank you, Filipe. Samar, if I could turn to you. I had a conversation with a former senior African official who's very experienced in the foreign policy of the region as a whole. And she said something to me that I think stood out a little bit. She said that there's not a person in Africa that is not shocked or stunned, I think she said, by what Israel and the United States are doing in Gaza, essentially presenting a view that this is not just something that Africans view as an Israeli action, but is a joint Israeli-American action. Could you react to that? Is that a fair assessment? Is that a perception that is widespread in Africa, that this is not just an Israeli action, but is an Israeli-American action?
Yeah, so I think it's important to state at the outset, Trita, that historically speaking, Africans have a long-standing sense of solidarity with the people of Palestine. And that sense of solidarity extends as far back as the 1950s and 60s in the anti-colonial struggle, and is especially prevalent and present in places like South Africa, which has its own history of apartheid. And so we've seen people taking to the streets in the masses across the African continent in the last several months in solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza. Now, as far as the sense of shock is concerned, I think that there are reasons to be shocked and reasons not necessarily to be shocked, in the sense that Africans have long been calling out the double standards of the United States when it comes to its so-called commitment to human rights and the rule of law. And we've seen that most visibly in relation to the International Criminal Court, right? We know that Africans were among the first and the most supportive of the International Criminal Court in its early days, among the first to join. And in the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've seen them very clearly pointing out the ways in which this is fundamentally reproducing the very power inequalities that continue to structure the global order more broadly, largely because the US has refused to become a member, much like other global powers, to the point that Africans have been expressing their protest and their resistance by, in some cases, threatening to pull out from the court, right? So that's why I say that, I think some people across the continent had reason to be shocked and others not necessarily so. But I do think that over the course of the last several months, the degree to which the US has maintained such unconditional support, both militarily and politically, for Israel in this relentless campaign, this genocidal campaign, that I think inevitably, at a certain point, you have to be shocked.
Interesting. Sarang, what Samar is saying here is that essentially there is a large convergence in terms of African perspectives on this. Would you say that extends beyond Africa, that there is that convergence across the global South? Or are there different trends that may go in contradictory directions on this specific issue? And if so, what are the trends, or what are the areas in which differences emerge?
Yeah, I think the short answer to that question, Trita, and I'm glad to be on this panel and glad to share this stage with my distinguished co-panelists. But to get your question, I think the dominant trend is that of convergence. I mean, you can look at the vote counts in the UNGA General Assembly, and you can see the numbers, and the numbers speak for themselves. I mean, we had in the last major resolution at the UNGA in December, we had 82% of Global South states that supported an immediate ceasefire, no preconditions. That's a very large margin of states. And so I think one can safely say that the dominant trend is that of wanting this war to end. However, there are some differences that emerge if you look carefully below the surface. When you look at especially the amendments that were introduced during the process of taking that vote in the UNGA. Specifically, there was a US-backed amendment introduced that called named Hamas in the amendment and labeled what happened on October 7th as a terrorist act and condemned Hamas. Now, of course, all states practically that I've seen have condemned what happened on October 7th. So there are no exceptions almost in the broader Global South space. But on the amendment, we see some differences because some states backed that amendment. And that amendment did not refer to Israel. It only referred to Hamas. And this was the objection of many states that voted against the amendment. But a significant set of states backed this amendment. And these states include large and important states such as Chile, Peru, Singapore, India, Philippines, Kenya, and others. However, again, to top that, it must be noted that none of these states let this amendment come in the way of supporting the final resolution. So the sentiment to end this war as the most urgent and unconditional thing to do was dominant in even this discourse.
But would you say that the convergence is simply because their perception of the facts on the ground on this issue? Or is it bigger than that? Is it about the fact that this is happening less than 2 years after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, an illegal invasion, and the very, very strong language by the Biden administration that that invasion was a threat to the rules-based international order, which apparently seems to have no bearing on what happens between Israel and Gaza now. In fact, we looked at it, and the Biden administration has almost stopped talking about the rules-based order. The few instances we see senior people use that terminology is almost exclusively on Ukraine, never on Gaza. Is it just about what's happening on Gaza, or is it something bigger that is fueling the sentiments in the global South about this issue?
Yeah, it's certainly something bigger. And I think the fact that the rules-based order rhetoric has been dialed back itself is a sign of where the winds are blowing on how the world, and I'm going beyond the global South, even some European states and others have taken this position, are seeing the hollowness of the rhetoric and the glaring double standards that exist in the international order today. So from that perspective, I think there are a number of points there that are worth noting. One is the fact that, I generally believe that most states, including those in the global South, act based on their national and material interests most of the time. But there come moments in the international system when there are events so beyond the pale that are so destabilizing and otherwise invoke such a major human response across the world that something else emerges. That something in this case, I think, is beyond what is normally seen in international relations. What we are seeing is an ideational factor that has emerged, the sense that international law is something important. In some cases, it has to be defended, even if that entails some risks for these relatively weaker countries. Most of these countries who are voting are not great powers by any stretch. Some are middle powers. But certainly all are somewhat vulnerable or very vulnerable to responses that may emerge. So there is certainly this sense that international law is something to fight for at some point in a crunch time. And secondly, I think the shadow of history in the global South, the colonial history that Samar referred to, emerges at these moments because Palestine has been seen by many states not just as an ethnic issue, far beyond the issue of ethnicity or race or religion. It's seen as the last, one of the last holdovers of the colonial era. And for example, a country like Indonesia is duty bound in its constitution to oppose colonialism in all its forms. And that's true for many other countries. And they're taking the positions that they have taken also based on this historical context.
Filipe, if I could pose the same question to you, international law is very central to Brazilian foreign policy. The rules-based international order seems to be a much less preferred term. From Brazil's perspective, and particularly mindful of some of the tensions that existed or irritation between the United States and Brazil over how to handle Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, how has the response of the United States and how things have developed in the Security Council affected Brazil's thinking of this conflict as perhaps being more than just the conflict between Israel and the people in Gaza right now?
Thank you, Trita. As a matter of fact, international law is so central to Brazilian foreign policy. It's actually enshrined in our own national constitution. So we take it very, very seriously. And the idea, perhaps, which is the underlying idea of the concept of rules-based international order, is that it can pick and choose selectively which rules to follow and to abide by. It's not what we think. It's not the way we think. As we've been saying, this war is a tragedy. How it affects civilians is hideous, but it speaks to a bigger problem. Of course, one of the bigger problems is the absence of Palestinian statehood. Brazil takes very seriously Israel's security, and if you allow me a quick historical digression at the end, I'll tell you a quick cautionary tale. But we also think it's about time the international community settles on recognition of Palestinian statehood and allows Palestine to be fully joined, that Palestine fully joins the community of nations. But even bigger as an issue is the lack of reform of global governance institutions. And that's where I think the word that Sarang has chosen, convergence among what's now called the global South, it's the key concept. What these countries have in common is a perception that the international order is profoundly asymmetric and detrimental to their interests. And the way to go about it, to correct those injustices and asymmetries, is reforming global governance institutions, including or primarily the UN Security Council. So the fact that the Council was paralyzed, the fact that we had 3 or 4 key draft resolutions vetoed in the Council, is a reflection of how the rules are bent against the global South or developing countries, or however we want to call it. If you allow me that quick digression, I would go back to 1947 when the State of Israel was created. And it was created by the hands of a Brazilian former foreign minister, former ambassador to Washington, called Osvaldo Aranha. That man was the first and actually the only president of the General Assembly to get reelected and serve 2 consecutive terms. And that gentleman chaired the session that approved Resolution 8181 with votes 33 countries in favor. You see that we had fewer members of the UN back then. 33 votes in favor, 13 votes against, and 10 votes against the partition of Palestine. That, for the literature, recognized that resolution as Israel's birth certificate. It's no coincidence that in the Osvaldo Aranha Museum nearby Jerusalem, not in Brazil, in Israel, you have the gavel that Osvaldo Aranha used to gavel Israel's into existence in the international community. We had the roll call spelling out the 3 votes in favor, the 33 votes in favor that gavelled Israel's into existence. We do not take Israel's security and existence and lightly. We take it very seriously, regardless of the fact that maybe Brazil-Israel relations now are not going through its finest hour. Now, with that, we feel that also the question of Palestine is not only a matter of historical justice, although it is, it's a matter of bringing peace and stability to the region, to the Palestinians, including and also the Israelis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Filipe. If I could turn to you, Samar. South Africa is a country that did bring Israel to the international Court of Justice. And that seems to suggest, I mean, it's important in and of itself, given South Africa's own experience, but this is one of the first cases we see a country from the global South taking a state that is broadly supported by the West, a break of a previous pattern, but also something that seems to have given Africa a new sense of confidence in terms of how international institutions can or perhaps should be working. Could you comment both on that as well as on the court case itself, if you can?
Absolutely. I think that to connect back with some of what we've been talking the last few minutes, the case brought by South Africa to the ICJ is one example of a much more assertive politics emerging from the global South that we've seen in the last few years, right? So just to reiterate the point that this is not only about Gaza, that we can look back to the Russia-Ukraine situation and the vote at the UN General Assembly when so many countries from the global South chose either to vote against or to abstain. And roughly half of those who abstained were from Africa. As we know, the basis on which many of these countries made those decisions was not out of support for Russia, but to make a very clear point about the double standards that are governing the global order. So the South African case, I think, is significant for a number of reasons. Nasreen Malik at The Guardian wrote a piece around the time that they launched the case, and she pointed out that it's not only Israel that's on trial here, and that South Africa is testing the West's claim to moral authority, right? So once again, there are much broader issues that are at stake. Malik said that the court case is emblematic of a wider confrontation that seems to ask if this human rights infrastructure is real or just a theater in the service of some international caste system. So to answer your point, your question, Trita, about whether, I mean, absolutely, the South Africa's leadership in this case, I think, has been a huge inspiration for countries across the global South, including within Africa, in the sense that they're reclaiming these international bodies, right, from which they have constantly felt either excluded by or unfairly under the jurisdiction or the limelight in a way that other countries have not been. And so this reclaiming of these international bodies is tremendously significant. And I think time will tell, right, whether this represents a trend for the better.
It's very interesting, Samar, because what you're saying, you know, this is a new confidence in the foreign policy of many African states, global South as a whole, I would say. But and Filipe talks about the importance of reforms to the governing structure of the world going forward. But it seems to presume that the mere taking the case to the court has had that impact. How do you think all of this will play out in terms of the belief that the court could be an instrumental element of a change global order, as well as larger reform and the confidence of the global South in their foreign policy, if the court case decides that what is happening in Gaza right now is deplorable, but it is not a genocide? If you could go first, Samar.
I think that's an excellent question. And I'm torn as to where I fall on an answer, in the sense that, you know, Mahmoud Mamdani, when he was responding to the initial findings of the ICJ case, made the point that the law represents an opening for politics. So rather than place so much emphasis on the law, on international criminal entities, whether it be the International Criminal Court, whether it be the International Court of Justice, we should view it simply as a starting point rather than placing all of our eggs in one basket. And for that reason, I think that we would all do well not to place so much emphasis and so much hope in these bodies as the primary solution to what are ultimately political questions, right? And so, you know, in terms of what lies ahead, whether or not, you know, I think it's more than likely that we will be disappointed by the ultimate findings of the court. And precisely for that reason, we should be mobilizing and thinking about other avenues towards justice.
Filipe, could you give a quick reaction to that as well? I think what Samar is saying at the end of the day, a lot of people would agree with, which is the changes in the governing structure of the world, as well as the voices of Global South, more equity, cannot be limited just to this court case, but it has become a very potent symbol of it. If it goes in the direction in which it's determined that it is not a genocide for whatever reason, technical or non-technical, what do you think that will do to the growing efforts to see changes in the global governing structure of the world, as well as this more greater confidence in the foreign policy of many global South countries?
It's a really good question, Trita. I think in a way, the reform of global governance and structures is already happening. You know, that Brazil is also chairing the G20 this year, 2024. And a lot of the action now happens on the sidelines of the UN and fora, such as the G20. It's not what Brazil wishes for. We place a very, very high importance, attach a great importance to the United Nations as the prime multilateral forum of the world. But if the decisions are not made, countries will tend to resort to the platforms where you can get decisions and action taken. Of course, Brazil endorsed South Africa's move to petition the International the Court of Justice. We've been following the case very, very closely, and we hope it produces a concrete result for the Palestinian people, for the people in Gaza who are suffering the most, that the ceasefire is established and violence can stop. But again, without Palestinian statehood, we do not see a promising future in the region. We need perhaps not so much a peace process, but peace itself. Not so much a credible pathway to Palestinian statehood, but Palestinian statehood and wide international recognition to it. Now we have the Summit of the Future in the UN General Assembly come September this year, and Brazil again is chairing the G20. Those efforts will try and be merged somehow to bring a more meaningful conversation about how to bring about the reform of global governance structures. I think that the state of the world now, as opposed to perhaps 10 or 20 years ago, when we had serious problems, the problems would not pile up the way they are now. If we do not reform those global governance structures, they date back to the 1940s, to the post-World War II international order. We will keep seeing violence break in various parts of the world, the use of force to be resorted to very liberally in several hotspots across the world. And it will be Ukraine, it will be Gaza, but it will be other places too. And what we can do to make sure that the voices of the global South are factored in the decisions is reforming those structures and making sure that the norms are more favorable to a broader constituency of the international order, and not only the oligopolistic design that we have as of now.
Very interesting. Sarang, feel free to answer that same question as well, but I also want to take it back a little bit to Gaza itself. I mean, we've seen that there's been quite a lot of frustration and irritation across the world with the Biden administration's position and standing in the way of a ceasefire. And that's what we've seen in the last 5 months. 3 resolutions at the UN that were vetoed, 1 that was watered down into oblivion, and then it wasn't vetoed, but the US still didn't vote in favor of it. Let's say that this goes on for another 3 months and you have another 2 resolutions, or at least one other resolution vetoed again by the United States. The Israelis may go into Rafah and we will have even more bloodshed. Tell me how you think this will affect the relationship between the United States and so many countries across the globe, not in terms of the bilateral relations, they will still want to be friends of the US, but to the point in which they are still supporting of or accepting of the idea of American leadership if this conflict continues in the manner that I just described.
Yeah. Just to add a couple of thoughts to what Samar and Filipe Nasser just said, I completely agree that law has utility well beyond law. that it is a core element of shaping politics. I mean, just imagine a counterfactual where we had no processes internationally. Nobody went to the International Court of Justice. By the way, there are two cases winding through it on Palestine. There's a previous one that was triggered in December 2022, which is a broader question on Israeli acts in Palestine. But there are also referrals to the International Criminal Court, one that dates back to 2014 and another one that Mexico and Chile have invoked recently. I don't know any other issue, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know any other international issue that is subject to so many legal proceedings as Palestine. And with that generates a kind of a normative shaping of global thought, global action, perhaps even local action. Perhaps we would not have had the kind of vote we saw in Michigan, coming back to American politics, had it not been for all of these international cases. The process itself has an impact regardless of the final decision. So I think it's extremely important that the legal process, we have to see the legal process actually extremely important in this entire discourse, regardless of where it ends up. Secondly, your question on where this is going, I think in terms of U.S. relations with the broader global South, there are, before October 7th, U.S. credibility on upholding the rules-based order, quote unquote, and on acting as a great power, and I am emphasizing the word great, not in the military sense, but in the sense of sort of being a scaffolding for a fair, reasonable, decent governing structure that, of course, also delivers for national interests. But that was already quite weak. I think, as Samar mentioned, Ukraine, the responses to Ukraine, the various other trends we have seen, Iraq prior to that, had already weakened U.S. reputational clout across the world. And I think you're quite right that in bilateral situations, countries tend to be narrower. They're focused on what they can get out of a negotiation. The real symbol of this emerges in global multilateral structures. This is where states start articulating their overall unease and, frankly, at this point, their alarm over where the international system is going or not going. It's creaking at the seams. It is potentially heading towards many more serious crises. And reforming those structures is essential. So the US will expect or should expect much more resistance over time because of incidents like these in global fora. And there are ways for the US to stem these losses to its own interests and reputation and actually reverse some of this course.
Interesting. Filipe, we have a question from the audience from Anne Moisan. How does the Global South view their responsibilities in establishing and maintaining the New World Order, not necessarily just a right to lead? For instance, what are they willing to do and act in addition to resolutions and talks? So it's putting a little bit of a pressure of responsibility on the Global South countries. And I'm going to change it a little bit and say, in terms of resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issue, obviously, one should not dismiss the tremendous importance of putting forward those resolutions and the work that Brazil and other countries did in negotiating that. But is that the end of it? Or are there other things that the Global South needs and can do, given the fact that it is claiming that it needs to have a stronger voice, that it does need to have a larger seat at the table? What would it bring to the table?
Trita, I thank you for the question and for the question of the audience. Brazil does not claim to speak for the Global South. I want to get this out there at the beginning. But I can say from the point of view of our own national interests and our own repertoire of action in international politics, that we choose diplomacy, dialogue, cooperation, respect for international law, preference for the peaceful resolution of issues as a means to express ourselves internationally. So when it comes specifically to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what we can give as a contribution is our good offices, is our ability to speak to pretty much every country around the world and to help set up perhaps a multilateral framework for talks to happen, But it is, and I'm afraid this perhaps will disappoint a little bit our audience, it is diplomacy, dialogue, and international law are means to relay our messages and make sure our national interests and points of views are heard.
But you did say something earlier on that I thought was quite noteworthy, because you made clear that what Brazil would like to see is a Palestinian state, not a pathway to a Palestinian state, which is a very crucial difference. This is the language that the Biden administration is using right now, and it's the language that reflects what's been going on for the last 30 or so years, which there's always a path to something, but never actually the achievement of it. Do you think that the war in Gaza now, how it's being conducted, the war crimes that are being committed, whether it's genocide or not, is going to transform into something bigger in terms of greater pressure from the international community and the global South for a real resolution of this conflict, rather one more peace process with a lot of nice words that at the end of it does not produce anything?
We've been having meaningful conversations with the administration, including about the Palestinian issue and the war in Gaza. And we feel like the way they're framing the issue might represent a step in the right direction. You know, Secretary Blinken was in Brasilia and in Rio in early February for the G20 ministerial meeting. And he had both an audience with President Lula and a conversation with Foreign Minister Vieira. And of course, the situation in Gaza was addressed in both conversations. So there is some level of convergence between the U.S. position right now and ours, but I think we need to move more decisively towards international recognition of Palestine as a state, as an independent sovereign state in the international community, which is something that Brazil did as early as 2010. And after Brazil's unilateral recognition, that's the word, several Latin American countries followed through and also recognize Palestine as a state. This is the time to make a decision, and this is Brazil's foreign policy's opinion, to engage in the kind of diplomacy that will result in Palestinian statehood as opposed to one more process. And we're willing to keep talking and to keep engaging to make sure that result is finally ultimately achieved.
Samar, if I could ask you to react to that, but also early on you mentioned how African states have tended to have a sympathetic view to the Palestinian issue or the Palestinians because of a sense of camaraderie, the colonization aspect of it. We saw that in Ukraine, the African states stepped forward and put forward a proposal of their own and try to make an effort to see that conflict resolved. Do you think that there is a momentum and the capacity in Africa or broader global South to do so and to break the deadlock in which the only processes that have been in place have been led by the United States and they have failed? And we're now at a point in which the US has credibility to lead future efforts, not saying that they shouldn't be involved, but saying that the manner in which the US has lost credibility makes it very difficult for it to lead such an effort. But will there be alternative constellation of countries that could lead it, and could Africa potentially step up for that?
I think the question really is, because there is no doubt that African states have consistently shown leadership on the global stage and consistently offered alternative plans, the plans of their own. And I can think of the example of the lead up to the US NATO intervention in Libya, where the African Union did present a clear alternative plan that the US just outright ignored. And so what to me that is revealing of is two things, right? One is the consistent disregard and underappreciation of precisely the kind of geostrategic thinking of African states that the US has shown, and two, the fundamental power inequalities that continue to be at play, in the sense that it was possible to simply ignore the AU's plan and proceed with the US plan. Now, I think the other thing that's significant here is the shifting demographics of the world as a whole, and Africa in particular, which by 2050 will represent 25% of the world's population, which is all the more reason why we need to be taking Africa seriously and the global South more broadly seriously, right? As a global majority, we cannot continue to think of African states and Africans as charity cases because the fact of the matter is, as I've been saying, they are offering their own solutions, right? So I think time will tell. The fact that South Africa did take such a significant step in launching this case at the International Court of Justice is hugely significant. And I do want to underscore what Sarang also said in terms of the symbolism of it and the degree to which it is empowering, inspiring, and likely to feed into other forms of mobilization, whether it is in relation to Gaza specifically and Palestine, Israel specifically, or other issues. And the final point I'll make is that the U.S. released a U.S.-Africa policy, a new policy in 2022 that coincided with the Russia-Ukraine conflict and with the more assertive politics that we were seeing come out of Africa at the time, right? In the sense that most African states were saying, look, we do not want to align. So they were invoking a politics of non-alignment. And ironically, even as the U.S. was championing its so-called partnerships with African states behind the scenes and within Congress, you were also seeing very patronizing language telling African states, well, we're going to be monitoring very closely who you cooperate with, especially in regards to China and Russia, right? And so that kind of double, I guess, contradictory set of diplomatic relations with Africa is not lost on African states. And I think it's likely that they're going to be weighing very heavily and thinking very heavily about the practical ways in which the U.S. is willing to engage with them, right? Rather than consistently only prioritizing U.S. interests and needs.
Interesting. We have several questions in the chat from Timothy Rush to David Spiegel, Rosemary Ghali, in regards to the BRICS. Now, I'd like to ask you, Sarang, and of course, it's complicated because with Russia's involvement in the BRICS, as well as U.S. sensitivity about China, although the Chinese are now sending some signals of wanting to play a bigger role in resolving the conflict in Gaza. But do you see, Sarang, the BRICS being able to play a role here, or is that outside of what where BRICS want to be or can be useful?
I think for the moment, it is unlikely because we have, as you mentioned, rather disparate different powers there with different inclinations on Gaza or different interests that they have with respect to the US that outweigh any such joint attempt. There are, of course, the new members, but the new members are have just joined. And I think the influence of the older ones will remain a little more significant for the time being. But I think the broader question that Filipe Nasser raised about the reform of global governance, this is ultimately the root problematic in the Global South's view of the world. It's two things. One is rise. The Global South countries, wherever they may be, middle powers or less of powers, want to do better, want to be more prosperous, and want to be more influential. But the Global South powers also want to create a world order, including institutions, whether they're multilateral development banks, the United Nations, other spaces of this sort that are more equitable, where they have more of a say commensurate with their current economic and political influence. The mismatch, we are stuck in an older framework from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and many things have changed. So this is where I think BRICS's energy is most focused on. All of this is tied to things like Gaza, because the reason why problems like Gaza fester, escalate, explode is because we don't have a system where we can have a sort of a shared responsibility, shared accountability, and shared decision-making. And this is, I think, where the BRICS will have an impact. This will be a longer run process. But this is how I see BRICS position in this question.
Filipe, as the B in BRICS, like to pose the same question to you. You did not mention the BRICS in terms of the diplomacy that Brazil is engaging in order to resolve this conflict. Do you see it as such that this should be done outside of the BRICS, or can the BRICS play a role in this?
I feel that the BRICS is both more and less what some perhaps Western media outlets would try to portray it to be. It's more in the sense that it's not irrelevant, and it's less that in the sense that it's not an anti-Western coalition by any way we want to see it. What it is a platform for dialogue and coordination on the political level. So when these countries come together, whether at the ministerial level or at summit level, these leaders can talk and share notes and perhaps bring a point of view that will percolate across the system, primarily through the United Nations as platform and the chief multilateral body of the world. Of course, there's a more economic dimension to the BRICS, which I feel it's very positive, including the new development bank, which helps spearhead development projects across the world, but mainly in the BRICS members, including the new BRICS member, the BRICS Plus members. But politically, this is a platform for dialogue. Countries, they go to the meetings, they go to the summits, they talk about the issues, they issue statements, they go back to their capitals, and perhaps with a more united sense of how to move forward in terms of reform of global governance, they can speak not in one language, but they can speak a similar language, which is not to say that they have the same positions or that they share the same points of view. Again, it's a platform, not a coalition of any sort.
That's interesting, and at the same time, as Nima Nourian in the chat asks, what we're seeing is a stronger reaction. At least that's what the person behind the question says, of some countries in the global South, South Africa, taking the case to the ICJ, for instance, than what we're seeing from some Arab states in the region themselves. And Samar, I would love to see your comment on that as to why it is that it appears that this issue is now driven more by global South countries in Africa. We saw the Malaysian Prime Minister yesterday essentially schooling the German leader on this issue. We're seeing it in Latin America with Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, others. Then we're seeing from the Arab world itself.
That's an excellent question. And I imagine that at least part of the explanation lies in the fact that Israel has been so aggressive in pursuing and deepening its diplomatic ties with a number of Arab states in the last several years, such that at the very least, economically, there's too much at stake for many of these Arab states to be confronting Israel in the way that we're seeing South Africa do today. And with that said, Israel has also been very proactive in trying to deepen its relationships with African states, to the point that it's requested observer status at the African Union. And so I do think that we shouldn't entirely, we shouldn't think of the African continent entirely as pro-Palestine, because I think the reality is actually a bit more complex, and a lot of African states have been much more muted in their response in a way that contrasts with the way in which they responded, for example, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. With that said, South Africa in particular, it makes sense, right? Historically speaking, why they have taken a particular leadership role, precisely the historical ties of between resistance movements, right? That of the African National Congress today is the ruling party, consistently invoking that history of resistance, such that it is it feels only natural that the South African government would be the one to take the lead.
Interesting. We have a question in the Q&A by Joseph Gerson. It's a good question, but it is it's pointing out how the United States has viewed the global South, which is an arena of competition between the United States and China. And of course, the perspectives in the global South tend to be that there's so much more than that. That's not even the primary thing that they constitute. But the question is, how has this conflict in Gaza and the US's support for Israel here affected the competition between the United States and China in the global south? Sarang, if you want to go first on that.
Well, I think in general, China is geographically far from the region, but it's taken a pretty strong stance about opposed to collective punishment and generally supporting a process, supported all the UN resolutions for a ceasefire. Just in the last few days, we are seeing some shifts in the Biden administration on the rhetoric towards the war. We have seen Chuck Schumer's speech yesterday. There seems to be some sort of a shift going on in Washington, perhaps tentative, perhaps limited, towards trying to put more pressure to bring this conflict down. And China sending its envoy may be a case where China sees an opening that the US is not as strongly opposed to anything it would do. Does that open up an opportunity for the United States and China to talk about this behind the scenes? Indeed, not just US and China, but really some of the global South's middle powers as well, and Russia. Well, that's unlikely, but at least some of these states, and try to come to some sort of understanding on how to nudge and push this war to an end. I don't know, but I wouldn't entirely rule it out. The last couple of days are showing some shifts on that, and China may get drawn a little more into it than it's been.
Filipe, I'm going to give you the last word, and I'm going to say, looking back at Lula's previous term, he stepped in and actually managed to get an agreement between Brazil, Turkey, and Iran that met the requirements that the Obama administration had put forward in regards to Iran's nuclear program. Unfortunately, the Obama administration changed its mind, rejected the agreement that had been reached. Lula also weighed in and he put his feet into the water, testing to see whether he could play a role in the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Brazil is no longer in the Security Council. You have mentioned about the work that Brazil is continuing to do in terms of diplomacy on this issue. But outside of its role in the G20, outside of its role in the Security Council or the BRICS, what pathways do you see for Brazil to play in order to materialize what you said, not just a peace process, not just a pathway, but an actual state of the Palestinians that would bring security both to the Palestinian people and to the people of Israel?
Thank you, Trita, although I don't know how to answer that question. What I can tell you for sure is that Foreign Minister Vieira is right now, as of now, traveling across the Middle East to express Brazil's support to the two-state solution and take the pulse of key stakeholders in the region to see what happens, quite honestly. We can only convey our messages, convey our support, offer our good offices, and this is how diplomacy is done, through shuttle diplomacy, going around, spreading the message, and telling relevant actors and stakeholders that if we move towards this direction, more peace and stability will also bring more economic progress, will bring more commerce, will bring more trade, more investment. This is the way to go about it. So the foreign minister, as of now, is traveling through Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, a couple other places, with a very clear message in support of the two-state solution and Palestinian statehood.
Very good. We're delighted to hear that, and of course, hoping that both Brazil's efforts as well as those others, hopefully in conjunction with the United States, can bring a final end to this conflict and security for both of the people there, as well as ending the escalation risk that the conflict is fueling throughout the region as a whole. With those words, I just want to thank all of you in the audience for participating, for asking your excellent questions, and of course, a huge thank you to Filipe, to Samar, and to Sarang for participating and sharing their insights with the rest of us. And I look forward to seeing you all soon again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.